Israelis 10 years from now are not going to identify as Western. Meaning the people, the Israelis, who are, like, I'm 32 years old, I already have 4 kids. And there are people in the ultra-Orthodox community who are younger than me with more kids than me.
Yeah.
The future of Israel is, for lack of a better term, Israel 20 years from now is a religious Middle Eastern country with nukes.
Yeah.
And if Israel's gonna be a democracy, it won't be Western. Meaning the more democratic Israel becomes, the less Western it'll be. The more Western it tries to remain, the less democratic it'll be. And the same will be true for all the countries around Israel. So I don't necessarily support Western democracy, but I do support organic democracy. That the will of the people should be expressed through the political system.
Let's imagine that external powers stop intervening in the Middle East. How can Israel make peace with people who are calling for a genocide of the Jews?
Well, first of all, I don't believe everybody's calling for genocide.
There are people and they are teaching these kind of stuff in their schools,
Right.
in their mosques, in their rallies. So how can you make peace with those kind of people?
Well, the ugly truth is that you have people saying nasty things on both sides. But my goal is not to take the situation as it exists right now and try to reconcile. My goal is to get to a situation where people aren't calling for that. And I think some of the incentives, not all of it. Like, let's take the Quran, for example. I'm not an expert in the Quran, and I don't claim to be an expert in the Quran. But I know I have 3 friends who became Muslims over the years. And they tell me, just through their own independent study, and they've shown me, I guess I could email you quotes they've sent me, of anti-Israel verses in the Quran and pro-Israel verses in the Quran. Like verses about the Jews coming back and to their homeland, and Allah gave that land to the Jews, meaning I think that there are verses in the Quran, from what I've been shown, that would reconcile peace between Arabs and Jews, or between other Muslim groups and Jews. The problem is today there's a political incentive, whether it's the imams or other political figures, to focus on the negative. And part of that is our fault, part of it is other people's faults. Because I'm coming from the Israeli side, because I'm Jewish and because I'm Israeli and I'm a Zionist, I will say that it's probably more appropriate for me to start with what we're doing wrong. And I think what we're doing wrong, meaning the things that we do to create a feeling on the other side of hatred, is we're forcing over 1 million people to live under a military bureaucracy. We're essentially people who want to visit a relative 20 minutes away have to wait 3-4 hours at a checkpoint to get there. You have walls being built through villages, people's property being usurped in order to build these walls. You have freedom of movement restricted. You can't force an entire population to live under those conditions for 20 years and be surprised when they call to eradicate the Jews.
I understand what you're saying, but you said that if the Western countries just stop what they're doing, we can make peace in a short period of time. It can't, because there were people who were raised by that propaganda, and it
right, but I'm putting the blame. Right. Okay. So let's take the propaganda for example. If you ask me when the conflict between Arabs and Jews started, if you ask me to identify the starting point of the Arab-Israeli conflict, I would say 1920.
Well, I will say 14 centuries ago.
Okay, well I'm saying 1920, and I'd be happy to hear why you think 14 centuries ago, but 1920 in my mind is simply because prior to 1920, there's no record that I know of Arab violence, nationalist Arab violence against Jews, or vice versa. And I think what happened in 1920, well, in 1919, Lord George Curzon became the foreign minister of England. And around that time, the League of Nations gave a mandate to Britain to make a Jewish national home in Palestine. And I think under Lord Curzon, remember this is also when the British Navy, Yehuda, we take a break from pictures for a while? Thanks. Around this time, the British Navy had moved from coal dependency to oil dependency. So it was in England's interest to be in the Middle East for a long time. Now, even though there was no oil in Palestine, Palestine is where the oil was sent to on train tracks to Haifa. In Haifa was the oil refinery, and from Haifa the ships went to the rest of the British Empire. So Lord Curzon, when he became foreign minister in 1919, or a year after, decided that England was going to do everything in its power to make sure that they get to stay in the Middle East forever. And they did what they essentially did everywhere else in the world, is divide and rule the native population. They basically incited people against one another. And the reason I bring this up is not just because it happened once upon a time, it's still happening. You talk about the anti-Israel or the anti-Jewish education in Palestinian schools, the textbooks that preach that hatred are funded by the British government. By the Parliament of it, meaning it was like 3-4 years ago I saw, and nothing to do with Israel, nothing to do with Arabs, there was a group called the British Taxpayers Association. You could Google it. Some people have left us here already. I'm sure some of you have iPhones. The British Taxpayers Association, they were protesting, not because they cared about either side of the Middle East, but because their money that they were paying in taxes was going to fund textbooks in schools under the Palestinian Authority. Now, Britain, the British government, doesn't only fund textbooks in the Palestinian Authority that talk about war against the Jews. They also fund Israeli organizations like Peace Now or Yesh Din. So you have foreign governments that are actively participating in a conflict by funding propaganda and political organizations on both sides. So we need the West to butt out because we can't even come together. I see it so much. Look, I lived in a neighborhood of Jerusalem called Ras Al Amud. It's a neighborhood that's, I guess, 98% Arab. I was one of the first Jews to live there. I lived there for 4 years. And that's really where I started to see things differently. And I remember a story that happened once. I was on the corner talking to one of my Palestinian neighbors, and we were just, hanging out for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes. And then I went to the store to get a drink. And when I came back from the store, I saw that some UN worker from Scandinavia was berating my neighbor for talking to me. Like, why are you talking to that Jew? Don't you know he's a settler? Don't you know he's a Zionist? Don't you know he's oppressing you? Don't you know? And on the one hand, my neighbor said, well, that's Yehuda. He lives next to me. Like, we're friends. Who are you? But on the other hand, he was afraid that this UN worker was going to inform on him to Fatah. And if he informs on him to Fatah, then he could be arrested for being a collaborator. He's a collaborator because he had a conversation with me. So Western involvement keeps us apart, meaning the Oslo Accords. Before Oslo, everybody knows what the Oslo Accords are?
Yeah.
Okay. Before Oslo, it was normal for an Arab in Bethlehem, to work in Tel Aviv. It was normal for a Jew living in Beit El to shop in Ramallah. Everybody used to stop in Jericho for ice cream on the way to the Dead Sea. It was one country. People lived together. No checkpoints, no walls. We can't even talk to each other anymore. The populations were forcibly segregated by Oslo. I have a Palestinian friend in Ramallah. He tells me, he goes, my father loved Israel. He says, my father, if you ask him, do you want to live under Israel or under Jordan? Israel. You want to live under Israel or under Arafat? Israel. 100% of the time. The kids today, the opposite. Why? And I thought it was because of what you said, the hatred being taught in the school. But he told me there's another reason. They don't know Israel. The only Israel they know are the checkpoints. That's Israel to them. They don't know people like me. They know checkpoints, they know military jeeps, they know curfews. That's Israel. And when that's the only Israel a person knows, you can't be shocked when they want to resist that, and when they want to resist that violently. I'm not saying what they're doing is right, but I'm saying I understand the motivational factors, and I'm saying if we want to make peace, it's one of the first things we have to take down.
Can I give a different perspective?
Sure.
Not that I fundamentally disagree with you, I don't. The reason for the checkpoints and a lot of the segregation that a lot of people hate was the claim of creating a separate or independent state. And with that comes bureaucracy, becomes borders, becomes demarcation, becomes systems, becomes organization. So it goes from this organic village type of,
Right.
can everybody get along, to, okay, who's going to be administering what, what's tax collection,
And who is
what's
administering?
jurisdiction,
Right.
it's going to be your police and your military. And so that's where, you're absolutely right, you're talking about what the byproduct of that activity was, but that is in direct result of the request to create a potential for a Palestinian state. So what we got
I
out of
agree
it,
with you.
what we
I-
got
I-
out of it was police and military on, Fatah and the coordination with Shabak, with the IDF, and systematizing it and post-certification,
Right.
all the all the stuff that's necessary for an actual country
Right.
to exist, at least as we see it in a Western model. That's what they've been trying. Agreed that it hasn't been very efficient, it hasn't been hugely successful in a lot of areas, but there have been some functional things that we can allude to that would create the sinew for the moment when somehow this breakthrough, this is the idea, that
Right.
the breakthrough agreement will come, and then they wouldn't be starting from scratch. They could actually move from institutions that are nominally functionally working, educational system, and so it took it out of that colloquial, sharing and, like you were talking about, which I also noticed and lamented, but at the same time, knew that it was necessary. If you didn't have these infrastructure in place and some agreement did break through and it would catch us off guard, then you could have chaos from that, because now everybody's trying to figure
Right.
out who's what, who's on first, who's on second. So that's part of where we're in this
No, you're right.
whole
That is a large part
pattern
of it.
right now while we're still trying to work this out.
And what they essentially have now, what the Palestinians have now, is basically a police state without a state.
Agreed.
They have a police state without a state, and they, when you talk to people in the when you talk to people in the Palestinian opposition, I mean the real opposition. I don't mean just Hamas,
Yeah.
because
feel like a swamp though.
You're talking about Islamic Jihad?
no,
Islam
I'm talking
offensive?
about people who aren't necessarily affiliated to a party.
Okay.
I'm talking about people who just don't like what's going on. They oppose it, but they're afraid to speak because they'll be called collaborators and arrested. So I'm saying that, like when you talk to them, they refer to the Palestinian Authority. The nickname for the Palestinian Authority in a lot of Palestinian circles are Dayton's Republic. Dayton's Republic is the name of the PA to a lot of people. Does everybody know who Keith Dayton is? So Keith Dayton is. Do we need to close this door? Or will that make everybody hot?
It's a little warm in here.
Yeah, okay, fine. Keith Dayton is the American general who trained the Fatah security forces. And they were essentially used, when you read in the newspapers how great Fatah is, because Fatah are arresting the Hamas guys, basically the way it's coined in the media, the way it's framed in the media, is that you basically have the moderate Palestinians going and arresting the extreme Palestinians. But what's really happening is you have this American trained militia going and stamping out all the legal opposition to Fatah. That's what's really going on. And it's just, and what's the difference, from our perspective, what's the difference between a moderate, from Fatah and Hamas? It's just whether or not the guy goes to Hamas. I mean, I think both organizations are equally committed to destroying Israel. And I don't think either organization are speaking for the Palestinian people. But we wouldn't know that because the only people we see on TV are either Fatah or Hamas. Or if we're lucky, sometimes PFLP.
We consider the checkpoints as a cause of the hatred, but I guess it's the result.
I think it's chicken egg. I think it's chicken egg. It's how much terrorism does checkpoint stop, and how much terrorism do checkpoints create. It's the question we have to ask ourselves. I'm not saying there's an answer. I'm a soldier. I've worked at checkpoints. I'm telling you that I would be much more comfortable in